I've never done a video about A.C. Grayling before, so here's a debate he did with Matthew Chapman against David Wolpe and Dinesh D'Souza. This debate is about whether religion, on the whole, is a good thing. Here's one reason why it might not be.
And so they tend to be very traditionalist, very conservative and rather retrogressive, and that explains a great deal of the social policy and political endeavour that the religions engage in.
The oldest religions lock many of their adherents into the moral systems of the Bronze Age or earlier. Once we view morality as dictated by a perfect, all-powerful God, it doesn't matter how much suffering we discover it causes, it is still obligatory. The difference between theistic morality and humanist morality is that humanist morality makes reducing human suffering a priority, while theistic morality views reducing human suffering as of secondary importance, if it is of any importance at all. Murder is not wrong primarily because of the suffering it causes. According to theistic morality, it is wrong because a god doesn't approve of it. The suffering it causes is an afterthought if it has any relevance at all.
That's one thing that they tend to have in common with one another. But another thing they have in common with one another, and it's a very important point this, is that they share a structural feature. In fact, the religions are paradigmatic of a certain kind of organization, what I call a monolithic ideology. A one-size-fits-all, top-down, totalizing ideology, which says, we've got the right story, and you've got to sign up for it. And if you don't sign up for our story, if you don't agree, you're going to pay a sanction of one kind or another. And during the course of history, those sanctions have sometimes been very terrible. It's in this respect in which religions in history and in their orthodox manifestations now, not in all their manifestations, tend to share with other kinds of totalizing ideologies. So that's why it's no great surprise that Joseph Stalin, for example, was educated in a seminary. What those totalitarianisms share is very, very common. Torquemada's Inquisition in Spain in the 15th century and Stalin's Soviet Union in the 20th century say the same thing. We've got the answer, you've got to agree, and if you don't, you're in trouble.
Conservatives sometimes argue that the brutality of Stalinism is due to moral relativism, but the opposite is true. In the Soviet Union, anyone who asserted that Stalin's dictates were not objectively correct, but rather his mere subjective opinion, would have been sent to the Gulag or worse. A community that permits all moral ideas to be challenged and questioned can only become tyrannical after some ideas are sanctified and no longer up for debate. Ideally, all ideas are up for debate, even the idea that it is ideal for all ideas to be up for debate.
Mother Teresa was once tending to the wounds of a leper in Calcutta and wiping the suppurating wounds from this sick and dying person. And a journalist who'd been following her around for several days said to her, "I wouldn't do that for $1 million. And without looking up, she said, "Neither would I."
Really? Because she wasn't shy about asking for or taking millions of dollars from people, and nobody really knows what even happened to that money. It wasn't evidently spent on the poor. Supporters of Mother Teresa say, she worked in horrible, disgusting conditions. How dare you criticize her when you would never put yourself through that? I certainly wouldn't have put myself through that if I had the millions of dollars Mother Teresa had. I would have put that money into building sanitary, well-equipped hospitals for the poor, rather than allowing people to die in filth like she did.
But does religion make us behave better? To partially answer that question, let me read you a verse or two from the Bible. Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 11 and 12. When men strive together one with another, and the wife of the one draweth near for to deliver her husband out of the hand of him that smiteth him, and putteth forth her hand, and taketh him by the secrets, then shalt thou cut off her hand. Roughly translated, this means that if you're in a fight and your wife tries to help you by grabbing your opponent's balls, you should chop her hand off. It's there. I mean, I can show you. I know it's kind of cheap to poke fun at the Bible because it's so easy, but there is a serious point here, which is that far from making us behave better, religion often complicates and distorts morality. By any reasonable standards, hacking bits off your wife is far worse than her squeezing your enemy's nuts.
Not only is this passage a weirdly specific prescription, proper wrestling technique isn't typically the preoccupation of religious morality, it also prescribes a very draconian punishment. It's not even clear that this is consistent with the Old Testament principle of an eye for an eye. Unless your wife pulls the guy's nuts clean off, why should she have to lose any body parts?
Evidence infuriates them, as does science itself. And this antipathy to science has slowed down stem cell research, continues to harm the health of women and girls, and contributes to cynicism about scientific issues like global warming.
Science has been held back everywhere and continues to be held back in some places because of religion. And religion has often been wary of modern medicine. Far too often do we hear about parents who allowed their children to die of easily treatable illnesses because they preferred to pray for their recovery rather than take them to a hospital.
I grew up next to my gay uncle and his partner. When I was 9, I discovered they faced long prison sentences if their homosexuality was revealed. This was justified by Leviticus 20:13, and the verse was often quoted by both politicians and the clergy. If a man lieth with a man as he lieth with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination, they shall surely be put to death. This barbaric verse is still used by Christians, including Catholics and evangelicals, and violence is only its most obvious consequence.
It's hard to imagine how you could justify the persecution of gay folks without religion. And now we get to my favorite lol cow, Dinesh D'Souza.
The first one is the idea that people who have religious beliefs are hypocritical. But notice that in making this accusation, what was being alleged is that religious believers have ideals higher than they can live up to. And this is advanced as hypocrisy. In other words, holding up to a standard and falling short of it. Now that is actually not hypocrisy. If you read the Bible, Jesus doesn't call people hypocrites because their ideals are too high. He calls people hypocrites who pretend to be one thing and are really another. The problem with the Pharisees wasn't that they had high principles, is that they didn't have principles, but they pretended to be something they weren't. So we've seen a subtle shift in the meaning of hypocrisy, a shift that is advanced by the atheist side. Why? To basically pull down the moral ideals that we hold up that are higher than ourselves. That, I would suggest, is a very bad thing.
The reason we like to point out when religious folks don't live up to their own ideals is because a lot of these ideals are silly, first of all. We don't think a lot of them make much sense. Secondly, the frequency with which some folks fail to abide by the more pointless standards to which they seek to hold others is evidence that these folks don't really believe in them either. At the very least, what belief they do have in these standards is not strong enough to motivate them to adhere to them at all times.
Matthew made the argument that religion is a function of where you're born. If you're born in India, you're going to be a Hindu. Actually, I was born in India. I was raised Catholic. But never mind that your religious identity is formed as a result of where you're born. If you're born in Afghanistan, you're a Muslim, and so on. Well, I think this applies to all our beliefs.
No, it doesn't apply to all our beliefs. It applies most often to our beliefs that we don't examine very carefully. Apostasy, especially in places where it carries significant consequences, is often very carefully considered. Practicing the religion into which one is raised is often not very carefully considered.
Let's say, for example, that somebody born in Oxford, England, is more likely to subscribe to the theory of evolution than someone born in Oxford, Mississippi. Somebody who is born in New York City is more likely to affirm Einstein's theory of relativity than someone born in New Guinea. Now, what does that say about whether evolution and relativity are true? Nothing. The fact of your birth is irrelevant to the merit of the idea.
D'Souza's missing the point. The fact that people readily absorb the ideas common to their geography is not intended as a criticism of the merit of these ideas, but rather the care with which these ideas are considered. A population's acceptance of any particular idea is going to be at least somewhat geographically contingent, but this is exceptionally true of religious ideas and superstitions. You won't find as much diversity of opinion about even recent scientific ideas as you will about religious ideas. Many scientific ideas must be more carefully considered because they have so many practical applications. No matter what their religion is, engineers everywhere in the world largely apply the same principles.
So there's a kind of sleight of hand here. You have to judge the ideas by their own merits. Now, would the world be better without religion? You can't answer that question without looking to see what religion has done in the world, but you've got to compare it to what the world would be like without religion. There's been some allusion to the boring crimes of religion.
The boring crimes of religion?
But let me suggest that those crimes, even the worst of them, are infinitesimal compared to the crimes of atheist regimes that are far greater in magnitude, far longer in duration, and actually are still going on.
D'Souza seems to think that if the Russians or the Khmer Rouge believed in a god, they would not have done what they did. This seems far-fetched, considering the fact that Ivan the Terrible fervently believed in a god and was still a mass murderer. Apologists sometimes retort that he didn't kill on the same scale as Stalin or Mao, but given the fact that Ivan claimed his brutality was biblically inspired, I don't think you can credibly argue that his theism is what prevented him from killing on an even larger scale.
You might have had some tyrants who killed who happened to be atheist, but they didn't kill in the name of atheism. The Christians killed in the name of Christianity. Now, Richard Dawkins is a respected biologist, and I think here you begin to see the problem when a biologist is allowed to leave the laboratory. Why? Because evidently the poor man knows no history. All you have to do is crack open the collected works of Karl Marx, and you will see that the atheism is not incidental. It's not some add-on, it's intrinsic to the whole ideological scheme.
Even if Marx thought that atheism is somehow conceptually inseparable from forced industrialization and the collectivization of farms, which is what caused most of the deaths attributed to communism, it isn't clear to me how that's the case. It certainly isn't the case that communism can't arise without atheism. Look at Acts chapter 4 verse 32, which says, "All the believers were one in heart and mind. No one claimed that any of their possessions was their own, but they shared everything they had." Acts chapter 4 verse 34 says, "For from time to time those who owned land or houses sold them, brought the money from the sales and put it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to anyone who had need." That's the essence of communism. This is the ideological scheme to which D'Souza is referring. Rather than atheism being necessary to this idea, Acts implies that this was inspired by belief in Jesus. Peter and John, the apostles mentioned in this passage, were running a fucking commune.
Dostoevsky said a long time ago, if God is not, everything is permitted. And Dostoevsky's point is that when we get rid of transcendence, when we create a world without religion, we license terrible calamities.
The opposite is true. If nobody can credibly say that they have a god on their side, then they must justify any authority they claim to have by showing its own merits, rather than by simply asserting a divine right. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.